Norman's first novel, The Song of Names, was published in 2002 and won the prestigious Whitbread First Novel Award.
It's basically a story of two boys growing up together in wartime London. One is a genius, a violinist of extraordinary ability, and the other is not. But he's the kind of symbiotic other half without whom the violinist can't function. So in a sense, it's a novel about the functioning of music, because music cannot exist without people of extraordinary ability and imagination, but it also can't exist without people of mundanity and practicality. Yeah. And so the story is basically of this genius growing up in London during the war, who disappears on the day of his debut, and in disappearing takes away half the life of, as it were, his symbiotic other half. And the Song of Names is the thing that pulls them apart and that brings them together again, or that may bring them together again in the course of the novel.
The central character is, or one of the two central characters is Dovidel, the genius prodigy. He's presented as both compelling to audiences and to individuals, but he also has this deeply repugnant side to him. And there's a great quote that I'd like to read out, and it's said by the father of Martin, the other boy. And he says, faced with a choice between saving the human race and having fluffy towels in their dressing room, they will always go for the towels. You're writing here as a novelist, of course, but it's impossible to ignore the fact that you're extremely familiar with the world of classical music. And I wonder if actually you think that that's an intrinsic part of what it is to be a successful soloist, that you have to constantly tread this line and live this paradoxical life of being hugely attractive and compelling to a very large number of people. But in order to do so, you need to be quite unpleasantly self-serving.
To a degree, yes. Nobody succeeds at anything without a measure of self-interest and detachment and, if necessary, callousness and cruelty. Graham Greene, whom I had the privilege of knowing, said famously, there are no great writers without a sliver of ice in the heart. You do so in art and creation. You express a great deal of warmth. You conjure up a great deal of emotion, but at the heart of it, there is always a line of vision, a detached line of vision, which sets you apart from what's going on around you and which can recoil against those who are closest to you. And that's the line that you quoted from Martin's father, the impresario, talking about the artists whom he adores and who are the basis of his living, and who occupy all of his waking thoughts. And at the same time, there is a part of him that holds them in contempt, because he can see that there is a part of them that holds him in contempt. And that's the nature of the relationship between the artists and the world, and particularly between the artists and those who engage them with the world. And that's one of the themes that I try to explore in the novel, having observed managers, agents, orchestral directors, good, bad, indifferent, very few outstanding, over a very long period of observing and writing about music. There is this very entertaining line of mutual contempt that comes out over the second drink. And it may not be genuine. I mean, that's the beautiful thing in fiction. You can say it, but it doesn't necessarily have to be what they really feel. It can be what just comes out over the second drink, and that is an adjustment, that's a correction, that's a way of them coping with the feelings of humiliation they suffer at the hands of their artists.
Is there a sense in which your first novel is supposed to be slightly autobiographical? Is this why it's a musical novel?
Not really, because it's not autobiographical. I mean, there may be bits of me.
But I wonder if that's where the autobiography lies.
Because in my professional life, I tried to detach it from what I did professionally. It was a way of getting away from all of that.
Yeah.
You know, I'd sort of done enough of that. I've written 12 books about music. I know how to write a non-fiction book. You go out, you do your research, you have a structure, you sit down, and you write it, and if at any point in the writing of it you find that you're blocked, it means you haven't done enough research, so you go out again.
Yeah.
And that becomes a kind of formula for writing. With fiction it's completely different, because the the characters take over, and you are at their mercy, and you actually have to relearn everything that you've done about writing. So I didn't really want my other life to intrude into it, but some of the subject matter came into it, and I couldn't really escape that. And then once it did, then I suppose one was able to share through the protagonists some of the things that one had observed.
One of the other main themes and areas that you write about is of Jewishness and of Judaism, and particularly how they relate to Dovidel. And in a sense, he embodies one of the great 20th century symbols of sympathy. He's a child. He's a Polish refugee. He's Jewish. His family have all been killed in the Holocaust. But on the other hand, he's incredibly self-serving, and he'll use people and discard them when they're no longer of any value to him.
I mean, in one sense, he's like any of us. He's trying to find his place in the world. He's been blessed with a gift. He's been afflicted by the history of the 20th century. So he is both hero and victim. And some way out of that, he has to try and find for himself a resolution with his identities, because there are several, as a human being, as an artist, as a Jew, as a Polish Jew, as an English boy in an English school, all of those things. More than anything, he needs to find something that will validate his existence. And the question there is it enough to play the violin? And I suppose the other question that lies in the heart of it is, how do we cope with individuals of extraordinary ability? How do we cope with them within the family? How do we cope with them as friends? How do we cope with them as partners in business and so forth? What is the language that we have to use in order to engage with people whose other life the ordinary person has no idea of? One
of the characters that you introduce, a real-life character, one of several real-life characters, including yourself,
you've given it away,
is Yosef Hasid, who I confess was a new name to me. His life clearly has some parallels with the life of Dovidel, although it differs in some key respects. Could you just tell us a little about Yosef Hasid?
Well, he was a Polish violinist like Dovidel, older than Dovidel. He came to London to study with Karl Flesch, who lived up the road there in West Hampstead, and along with Ida Handel and Ginette Neveu and various other famous violinists. And he suffered mental illness, and he was put into a mental home. They subjected him to a lobotomy, and he died there in the 1940s. It was a tragic loss of an outstanding talent. I mean, everybody, Ida Handel is probably the last person alive who knew him, speaks of him as one of the untouchables, but somebody whose life was plagued by illness. But in a sense, the way that as it were, biography, autobiography, personal acquaintance intrudes upon the novel. When the novel was finished, when it was published, when it had won the award, when it was all there and talked about, a photographer called David Farrell, who works with my wife, came round and asked to see me and said, how did you know about the Karl Flesch classes? I said, well, I'd heard about it from various people. He said, well, I played the violin as a boy, and he let me sit in on his classes, and I knew Joseph Hasid. I said, no. He said, yes, we used to, during the Blitz, we would go together, two boys, and go down to St. John's Wood Underground Station and sit there on the platform, sleep there overnight. So the reality intrudes on the fiction that I created.
I want to ask you about another quote, which is possibly my favourite quote of the novel, and it's by Dovidel himself, who misses his grand debut in London, which is meant to launch his career. And years later, Martin goes and finds him and says, what happened? And Dovidel said this: I was made out to be the best violinist since Chrysler, but I did not feel that way. I knew that others would discover sooner or later what I already knew, that my reputation was many times greater than my ability. I was born with the curse of an intelligence larger than my talent. And I think this is a wonderful quote for anybody whose career isn't quite going to plan. I plan to use it frequently in the future, but I wonder if you think that actually this almost willful ignorance of your own failings is something that you need to push yourself forward as a soloist or as a musician generally, or whether it's actually something that needs to be harnessed. I'm thinking of people like Monet and Stanley Kubrick who could doubt their talents hugely, but then of course produced great work.
It's one of the most attractive facets of any human being, and in an artist it's overwhelmingly attractive. When you see someone for whom you have evidence that they are an outstanding artist, from whom you have respect and affection, and you see at the heart of it their own lack of belief, their own need for validation that what they are doing is important, is different, is essential. That's a compelling thing. There are artists who are smitten with self-doubt because they're not intelligent enough to appreciate what it is that they do, and there are others who are smitten because they are too intelligent, and they can actually see the bigger picture, and they wonder whether this small thing that I do is that it?
Yeah.
And those are the great ones. Those are the great ones. The others, I mean, there are plenty of others who trundle along, believing the hype, are quite happy to come to every new town and be garlanded and celebrated and told they're the greatest on earth, and they will beam and luxuriate, and those are the uninteresting ones.
You're too young to have experienced the Second World War, but you set your novel in the Second World War. You have first-hand experience of the other areas that you discussed, Judaism and Jewishness, London, and of course music and the music industry. Why set the novel in a period of which you have no direct experience?
Again, the answer is I don't know. Why did it have to be in that period? I'm not sure. I think it's probably to do with autobiography. I was born in 1948. My sisters were all born in the 1930s, and they raised me. So I grew up with these teenage sisters who gave me the sense that I missed all the fun. The war was when it all happened. You know, the war was when we got bombed, we got evacuated, we saw London Bridge burning, we did this, we did that. And all I saw were the empty bomb sites. And so somewhere in my unconscious is this idea that I should have come along sooner. And then along with that, my parents had been very active in refugee efforts during the 30s and the 40s, and even as I was growing up, there was still a stream of people coming through the house and staying over because they had nowhere to go, or because they were between countries, or because they were just coming back to say thank you. So I grew up with that sense of unbelonging and fluidity and transience and the chanceness of life. Which all stems from the 1930s, the Hitler period, the war. And the idea that people were really fighting for survival. They weren't fighting for better living conditions or struggling for survival. It wasn't for better living conditions. It wasn't for another bathroom. It was matters of life and death. Somewhere within me, there is a sense that I missed out.
One of the characters in the novel is inanimate, which is the violin. Dovidel is lent quite early on a Guadagnini, a beautiful Guadagnini violin, which comes to symbolise many things, I think, in a, I'm tempted to say in a ring-like way, whether that's Wagnerian or Tolkien-esque, it could be either. It lends the owner great power and happiness, but there's also a sense of liberation when it's taken back or it's lost.
It's about what it means to have a real relationship and to lose it. And then to question every other relationship and to pose every other beside that as for its inadequacy. Set beside that, the violinist and the instrument. And you have a kind of artificial paradigm of non-relationship. In no other form of art is there a bond so strong as that between a violinist and the instrument. It possibly exists with viola players and cellists, they may tell you, but I don't think it's so. I think it's just violinist. No pianist feels for his piano as a violinist does for his violin. No person on any other instrument. No artist for his brush. No writer for his pen or hers. The violinist bond is unique in music because the violinist imagines that only through this particular instrument, only through this particular tool, can he or she find expression, and the tool itself is then so connected with the player that it's named after the player for all time to come, so that a Stradivarius that was played by Vieuxtemps is still, Vieuxtemps, who died in the late 19th century, is still to this day known as the Vieuxtemps Stradivarius, and the Chrysler and the Isaïe and so forth. Is that a real relationship? No, it isn't. It's a kind, it sort of mocks the real relationship. It's the place in which the violinist can retreat because it's the substitute. Yes, it's not, it's not the plastic doll. It's nothing of the sort. I mean, it is a valued relationship of a very different kind, but it is a place where the highly strung violinist, and I use the adjective advisedly, can retreat into a place of quiet, knowing that the fidelity is absolute, knowing this is a relationship, unlike any other, that cannot be breached.
Yeah. But is there not a sense that you have to be, if you've got such a wonderful violin, you have to be equal to that violin? And they thought...
Yes, Miguel. Yes. And therefore it's also an expression of your own inadequacy.
Yeah.
You know who's played this violin before you.
The pivotal moment in the book occurs when Dovidel hears the eponymous Song of Names, which changes his whole outlook on life and music.
Song of Names appears in the novel as a means of memorializing the dead, and it's, to the best of my research, it has never existed, even though various people have come up to me and told me that they'd heard of it, they knew of it, but I haven't been able to validate it in any way. One of the primary duties in Judaism, actually probably the highest duty of all, is to bury the dead and mourn the dead, remember them. The first thing that Jews do when they set up a new community, when they move into a new place, is buy land for a cemetery. Before they have a synagogue, before they have a school, before they have anything else, first thing you do, Abraham did it in the Bible, first thing you do, you buy land for a cemetery. Taking care of the dead is the highest priority. So during the Holocaust, when people were dying in droves, and many of them without families because their families had died already, there was no actual way of remembering them. And what I bring in is a Hasidic rabbi who finds a way of remembering them, who tells his followers, go out, and everyone that you see today who has died, everybody that you see on the street, get a name, bring me back a name, and I will work out a way of remembering all of those names so that when all of this is over, and should some of us survive, we will be able to find their relatives who will memorialize them in the Kaddish prayer. But we will conserve the names even as they try to wipe them out. And the way of doing that was by theme and variations. Yeah. Many of the Hasidic rabbis were composers. In fact, the whole of Hasidic Judaism starts with this idea of rejoicing in God rather than worshipping God. And the way of rejoicing, especially for people who were simple and in many cases illiterate, was to give voice to a song. So the Rebbes were composers, and much of what they composed was done on a theme and variations principle. It's I think I mentioned in the novel that the founder of Hasidism, the Baal Shem Tov, was actually born in the same year as Johann Sebastian Bach. They're contemporaries. Yeah. So the theme and variations between what he does and the Goldberg variations, there are affinities there. And so it is possible, actually, to store hundreds, thousands of names in a tune with variations that these Rebbes would compose. And again, once I'd finished the novel, I happened to be sitting with friends whose father was over, and he was singing something at the table. He was going yum bum bum, cracked voice. He was a man in his 80s. I said, "What's that you're singing?" He said, "Oh, you wouldn't know." He said, "Tell me." He said, "Oh, it was something I learned, as a child from the Rebbe." I said, "This really interests me because the means of transmission between the Rebbes, who by the end of the 19th century, most of them lived deep in the country, in Poland and in Russia, and their followers lived in cities. How did the new tunes get transmitted from where the Rebbe lived, 500 kilometers away, to where their followers had a community? And what was the means of transmission? He said, "You're looking at it, it was me." I said, "How was that?" He said, "Well, when I was a boy, I had a good ear and I had a good voice, and people clubbed together and they bought a train ticket, and I went out and would spend a week with the Rebbe, listening to all the new songs. And then I would bring them back and I would sing them to the others and we would all have them." I said, "But how did you do that?" He said, "Look, it was simple. There would be a tune, it would go like this. And there would be another tune and it would go like this. And then the first tune would slightly change. And then the second tune would slightly change. And then they would combine. And then there would be, the combination would breed a slight change to the right, a slight change to the left. What I'm listening to is theme and variations."
Yeah.
And he was actually saying, and it went in 4s, it went in 8s, it went in 16s, it went in 32s, it went in 64s.
Yeah.
The mnemonic power of music, the ability of music to store information and to implant it in ways that cannot be erased. Yes, that's one of the things that finds its way into the novel.
Suddenly, in the context of the novel, music has a much more functional role. It becomes a tool for recording, for remembrance, and for remembering, suddenly totally subsumed under its religious and social context. Do you think there's a sense in which we've made the world of concert music, in a sense, so hermetically sealed and decontextualized that as musicians we find it hard to make sense of that? Is this really about Dovidal just trying to find sense in what it is he's doing?
Absolutely, yeah. Yes, it's about finding meaning in music and finding the purpose of music, and in a way that in the formalized structures that we have for presenting music we often lose, because we're overtrained. You know, anybody who gets up onto a concert platform these days is wildly overtrained in comparison to anybody who did that 50 years ago or 100 years ago, let alone 200 years ago. So they've lost the organic sense of making music just to make music. They're there to make music as a living, as a profession, as a vocation. But there have been so many strictures that have been drummed into them along the way, from their first days at music school right the way through to the day they got accepted in an orchestra or they became a soloist or a conductor or whatever, that the impulse has become hidden away at the heart of it, and the honest ones still continue to look for the impulse.
Yeah.
Many of the others don't bother.
I want to talk a little bit, before we talk about your second novel, about the whole process of writing fiction. You write about music, and you write in a non-fictional sense, and you write about musicians and the music industry. I wonder, is there a different process in the way that you conceive a novel about music from the way you conceive a book about music?
Completely different. Yeah. Completely different. When you're writing a documentary book, you have a grid. You know you have a beginning, a middle, and end, and you know roughly along the path that you're going. With the novel, the first thing that you discover is the characters. Once you've set the characters on paper, they get on with it. You don't, you've placed 2, 4, 6, 8 individuals with certain preordained characteristics,
yeah,
and then you just sit back and see how they interact and see what they make of the situation that they found themselves in. So it's, as a writer, you're fairly helpless in that situation. You can tweak a bit, you can tune a bit, but if you try to direct them, if you try to push them down some preordained conclusion, you're going to create a false and very bad novel, so you don't do it. Yeah. You learn early on that it's an aleatory process. Yeah. And I can honestly say that I didn't know how the novel was going to end until the morning that it ended.